Continuing discussion of classical conditioning, going beyond the basics in classical conditioning. All right, so the next thing that I'm going to tell you about is higher order conditioning. With higher order conditioning, you move beyond just pairing two stimuli. So remember, with your simple basic classical conditioning, you have two stimuli. One is a neutral stimulus, another is an unconditioned stimulus. You pair them so that eventually the response that goes with the unconditioned stimulus also starts to happen with the previously neutral stimulus. It becomes a conditioned stimulus. All right, so with Pavlov's dogs, our classic example, food elicits saliva naturally. It's an unconditioned stimulus. It gets an unconditioned response. But then you pair it with a bell, a neutral stimulus of a bell, gets paired with the food during the acquisition phase. And then the dog starts to salivate to the bell alone. That bell has become a conditioned stimulus. Well, what if we took that and built upon it? With higher order conditioning, you pair a new neutral stimulus with the conditioned stimulus. All right, so the conditioned stimulus has now taken on some meaning. It has a response that goes with it, and so you can build and you condition. So you can do conditioning without presenting the original unconditioned stimulus. So you could take the bell and pair it with a visual or a sound of any sort, and pair them over and over again. And if the dog salivates to this new neutral stimulus, then it has become a conditioned stimulus. So higher order conditioning, you build. You condition one thing, and then you condition something by pairing it with the thing that you have conditioned. So it involves more stimuli, more steps, right? So that's higher order conditioning. Now, another thing to tell you about is to talk about just various additional ways that conditioning could occur. And we have mentioned previously how emotions can be conditioned. Like we learned from the Little Albert study, you can have conditioned emotional responses. You can also condition other bodily functions, and one area is in conditioning of taste or reactions to food. So we have this thing called conditioned taste aversion. This is where you essentially learn to dislike a food. How would this happen? If you have a negative experience with eating that food, like if you eat tainted food, or if you get sick, if you have to, I know some people are sensitive to talking about certain bodily digestive functions. Trigger warning. But if you vomit, all right? If you vomit up food, sometimes through no fault of the food itself, you then have a negative association with that food, and you do not want to touch it again, at least not for a while, because it makes you think of being sick. It makes you think of throwing up. All right. And so you can have this conditioned taste aversion where maybe you ate something while you were sick, you threw up, and it used to be your favorite food, but you're like, I don't ever want to touch it again. That's disgusting. I think of vomit now. When I look at that, that was conditioning that led to that response. And you could eventually have extinction of that response. You could also have spontaneous recovery where you think, I'm fine, I'm never going to do that again. And then somebody serves you that favorite food and you're like, oh, there it came back again. I had some spontaneous recovery. That conditioned taste aversion came back. All right. And so that can be conditioned too. Sometimes you dislike a food because of this conditioned taste aversion. I also, this is not a conditioned taste aversion. This is a conditioned scent aversion that I always think about. Way back in my youth, way back in the 80s, when I was in 7th grade, I had a boyfriend. So 7th grade, it was a serious relationship. It didn't last long, and he dumped me. And the thing about this person is he really liked a certain type of cologne. It was Polo cologne, by the way, which is it was very big, very popular in the late 80s. And he liked this cologne so much, not only did he wear a lot of it, he washed his jacket in it. And this was the late 80s, so it was an acid wash jean jacket, of course. And so, you know, he actually did a rinse cycle with the whole bottle of Polo. So he really, when he wore that jacket, he really smelled like Polo. All right, after he dumped me, I would smell Polo and I'd be like, I'd have those negative reactions. I hated all sorts of people through no fault of their own because I associated that smell with that person who broke my heart. He dumped me. All right, so you can have all sorts of behaviors and feelings and reactions can be conditioned through classical conditioning. Now, another term that I want you to know about is biological preparedness. This has to do with the fact that some learned responses, some conditioning happens particularly easily. And one of the reasons that this might happen is there may be a survival advantage to learning particular responses. One example is that human beings learn to fear certain things quite easily. And they're often things that are dangerous, like snakes, for example. When a human being learns to fear a snake, all right, it's an easy response to learn, and that may be because there would be a survival advantage to learning that response, because then you stay away from snakes and then you are not harmed or killed by the venomous ones, right? And so certain responses are easier to learn. It's an organism's predisposition. They kind of like they're born with it. Their predisposition to develop associations between certain types of stimuli and responses based on adaptation, based on evolutionary survival. All right, so certain responses are learned easier than others, perhaps because you are more likely to survive if you learn that response. All right, in the next video, let me just check, yes, making sure I remembered and did everything there. All right, so that's it for classical conditioning. That's enough, right? Next videos will deal with a different type of conditioning called operant conditioning.